The Black Door, you've seen it 1,000 times. World leaders stepping through, prime ministers waving at the cameras before making historic announcements, protesters gathering at the gates, photographers jostling for position, the most photographed entrance in Britain, maybe the world. Politicians stand on that doorstep to declare war, to announce resignations, to celebrate victories, to face defeats. The door itself has become an icon, as recognizable as Big Ben or Buckingham Palace. But that door, that famous black door at number 10 Downing Street, hides something most people never consider. Behind it sits a building that by all rights should have collapsed decades ago. A structure so poorly built, so fundamentally catastrophically unsound, that it's been on the verge of demolition more times than historians can count. A house constructed by one of history's most notorious traitors, built cheap on swampy ground with shallow foundations and inferior materials, bombed by the Luftwaffe during the Blitz, attacked by IRA terrorists with homemade mortars, rebuilt in secret during the 1960s, painted black to hide the fact that its bricks are actually yellow underneath. And through it all, for nearly 3 centuries, the most powerful people in Britain keep walking through that door, making decisions that shape the world, while the walls crack incrementally, the floors settle and sink, and engineers install steel pins to stop the façade from falling into the street. Winston Churchill directed World War II from rooms that should have been condemned. Margaret Thatcher ran Britain for 11 years in a building held together by fresh plaster and political will. Tony Blair raised children in apartments where bomb-resistant windows are standard equipment. This is the dark story of 10 Downing Street. The residence built on betrayal by a man who switched sides so many times his contemporaries called him a perfidious rogue. The palace that's really a death trap, requiring constant, expensive, never-ending repairs just to remain standing. The symbol of British power and democratic continuity that almost wasn't, that came within yards of being obliterated multiple times, that survives today only because tearing it down would feel like admitting weakness. Behind that black door are over 100 rooms, secret corridors, underground bunkers, state dining halls, private apartments and offices where civil servants work around the clock. There's a cabinet room where the table dates from the Victorian era and prime ministers have plotted wars and negotiated peace for 200 years. There are drawing rooms where kings dined and astronauts were celebrated. There's a garden where a mortar shell exploded 30 yards from the Prime Minister in 1991, and there are foundations of concrete and steel driven deep into marshy ground, replacing the rotting timber and rubble that George Downing left there in 1682. If you love diving deep into the hidden histories of the world's most famous buildings, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. We're pulling back the curtain on places where power lives and revealing the secrets they don't want you to know. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. Now let's step inside the most powerful address in Britain and uncover what's really holding it together. The year is 1660. England has just survived 2 decades of civil war, revolution, and chaos. A king has been executed in public, his head severed in front of shocked crowds. A republic has been declared, then failed spectacularly. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector who ruled with an iron fist, is dead. His son Richard tried to continue the republic, but lasted barely a year before everything collapsed into confusion and violence. Now the monarchy is being restored. Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, is returning from exile to claim his throne. England is holding its breath, uncertain what vengeance the new king might take on those who killed his father and supported the Republic. In this chaos, one man sees opportunity. His name is George Downing, and he's about to become one of history's most successful traitors. A man so skilled at switching sides and betraying former allies that he'll die wealthy, knighted, and rewarded with prime London real estate. His name will endure for centuries. Attached to the street where British prime ministers live, even as his reputation becomes synonymous with treachery. George Downing wasn't born in England. He entered the world around 1623 in Dublin, Ireland, the son of Emmanuel Downing, a Puritan barrister, and Lucy Winthrop, whose brother John Winthrop served as governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When George was still a child, his family moved to the American colonies, part of the great Puritan migration seeking religious freedom and new opportunities in the New World. Young George grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, in a society of stern religious believers who saw the colonies as God's new kingdom, a place where they could build a better, purer England. In 1638, John Harvard died and left money and books to found a college. 2 years later, Harvard College opened its doors. George Downing was in the first entering class. He studied there from 1638 to 1642, part of a tiny group of students in a rough wooden building on the edge of the wilderness. When Downing graduated in 1642, Harvard had produced its first class, 9 students total. George Downing was one of them. Harvard immediately hired him as their first tutor, recognizing his intelligence and capability. But teaching in the Massachusetts wilderness wasn't enough for George Downing. He wanted more. He wanted power, wealth, influence. In 1645, at age 22, he left Harvard and sailed for the West Indies as a preacher and instructor of sailors. The ship he sailed on carried something else besides passengers: slaves, human beings shackled in the hold, being transported to work Caribbean plantations. Downing sailed alongside this horror, taking payment for his work. It was his first taste of how fortunes were made in the mid-17th century, not through virtue or hard work, but through exploitation, opportunism, and moral flexibility. From the Caribbean, Downing sailed to England. The timing was perfect. The English Civil War had erupted in 1642, pitting King Charles III and his royalist supporters against Parliament and its armies. By the time Downing arrived, Parliament was winning. Oliver Cromwell, a minor gentleman farmer turned military genius, was leading the parliamentary forces to victory after victory. Downing, seeing where power lay, joined up. He became a chaplain in Colonel John O'Kay's regiment, preaching fiery sermons about Republican virtue, about the righteousness of Parliament's cause, about the evils of monarchy and tyranny. Downing abandoned preaching almost immediately for something more lucrative, a military career. Between 1647 and 1651, he pursued advancement with single-minded intensity, participating in the battles of Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. These were brutal, bloody affairs. Thousands died. Cromwell's forces crushed the Royalists. During this period, Downing was a strong upholder of the Republican cause. When King Charles I was put on trial and executed in January 1649, his head struck off on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Downing supported it enthusiastically. The king was a tyrant, he said. The execution was justified. Divine providence was on Parliament's side. Cromwell noticed Downing. The young man was smart, ambitious, and utterly without scruples, perfect qualities for intelligence work. In November 1649, Cromwell appointed Downing as Scoutmaster General of Parliamentary Forces in Scotland. Scoutmaster General sounds quaint. It wasn't. It meant Downing was in charge of military intelligence, of building spy networks, of gathering information on enemy movements, of hunting down royalists and monitoring threats. Downing was good at it, very, very good. He built networks of informants, he learned codes and ciphers, he developed a reputation for getting results. In 1654, Downing was elected Member of Parliament for Edinburgh in Cromwell's hand-picked Parliament. By 1657, he held multiple lucrative positions. He was Teller of the Exchequer, managing government finances, earning £500 a year, an enormous sum. He was also drawing a salary as Scoutmaster General. The money flowed. Downing was accumulating wealth at a rate that would have been unthinkable in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but the real opportunity came in 1657, when Cromwell appointed Downing as his representative to The Hague in the Netherlands. This was one of the most important diplomatic posts available. The Dutch Republic was the foremost economic power in Europe. England and the Netherlands were rivals, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, always wary of each other. Cromwell sent Downing to negotiate, to build alliances, to advance English commercial interests. It was a crucial position. Downing barely bothered with actual diplomacy. Instead, he spent most of his time spying on English royalists living in exile in the Netherlands, on Dutch politicians, on Dutch military men, on anyone who might be useful. He sent coded reports in diplomatic pouches to John Thurlow, Cromwell's spy master. The intelligence flowed steadily. Downing was building a reputation as one of the most effective intelligence operators of his era, a man who knew everyone's secrets, who had sources everywhere, who could find out anything. Among the English exiles Downing was supposed to be monitoring was Charles Stuart, son of the executed king, the man who would eventually become Charles II. Charles was living in the Netherlands under the protection of his sister Mary, who had married into the Dutch royal family. Downing tracked Charles's movements, reported on his meetings, monitored his plots, and if later accounts are true, Downing also made contact with Charles directly, warning him of assassination plots. Whether this is true or propaganda invented later is unclear. What is clear is that Downing was positioning himself, keeping options open, making sure that whoever won, he'd have a patron. In September 1658, everything changed. Oliver Cromwell died. His son Richard Cromwell tried to take over as Lord Protector, but Richard lacked his father's authority, military support, or political skill. The Republic began to crumble, factions fought, the army and Parliament clashed, chaos spread. By May 1659, Richard Cromwell had resigned. England was rudderless. George Downing, watching from The Hague, saw which way the wind was blowing. Restoration was coming. Charles Stuart would be king. The question was how to survive that transition when you'd spent a decade serving the regime that executed Charles's father and hunted Charles himself. Most of Cromwell's supporters faced execution or exile. Downing faced something worse. He was a known regicide supporter, a former chaplain who'd preached for Parliament, a spy who'd tracked royalists. He should have been on every execution list. Instead, Downing switched sides. The details remain murky. Historians argue about exactly when and how Downing made contact with Charles II and what he offered in exchange for protection. What's clear is that Downing provided intelligence, secrets about Cromwell's government, documents that proved Downing's usefulness, information about other parliamentarians who might be dangerous. Downing made himself valuable enough to be worth saving. When Charles II returned to England in May 1660 to claim his throne, George Downing was waiting. On May 21, 1660, at Breda in Holland, just before Charles embarked for England, the king knighted Downing, Sir George Downing. The spy who'd hunted royalists for Cromwell was now Sir George, rewarded by the restored monarchy. He kept his post as teller of the Exchequer, one of the most lucrative positions in government. Charles confirmed him as envoy to The Hague, and the king gave him something else, a tract of land south of St. James's Park, adjacent to the site of the old Whitehall Palace, marshy ground that nobody particularly wanted, but land in London, land near Parliament, land that could be developed. It was a gift with potential. Downing's treachery wasn't finished. To prove his loyalty to Charles II, he needed to demonstrate that he'd truly switched sides, that he wasn't a secret Republican. So Downing hunted down his former comrades, 3 men specifically, John Barkstead, Miles Corbett, and Colonel John Okey. Okey had been Downing's commanding officer, the man who'd allegedly sponsored Downing's education in America. the colonel, whose regiment Downing had served as chaplain. These three men had signed King Charles III's death warrant. They were regicides, wanted for execution. After the Restoration, they fled to the Netherlands, thinking they'd be safe under Dutch protection. George Downing, now serving Charles II, tracked them down. He engineered their arrest. The Dutch government resisted, not wanting to extradite them. Downing persisted, using every diplomatic tool and dirty trick he'd learned. Eventually, despite considerable opposition from the Dutch, the three men were seized and taken to England. They were executed, tortured, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The brutality was extreme, even by the standards of the time. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, watched Downing's actions with disgust. Pepys had worked for Downing as a clerk at the Exchequer and knew him well. He wrote that Downing's conduct was odious, though useful to the king. Pepys called Downing a perfidious rogue, and remarked that all the world took notice of him for a most ungrateful villain for his pains. The phrase perfidious rogue stuck. That's how Downing was known among his contemporaries. A useful man, yes. An effective operator, absolutely, but utterly without honor or loyalty. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where Downing had been raised and educated, people were furious when news reached them of his betrayals. Downing had blamed his Republican sympathies on principles sucked in during his time in the American colonies, essentially throwing his former teachers and mentors under the wagon. It became a proverbial expression in New England to refer to a false man who betrayed his trust as an errant George Downing. His name became synonymous with treachery in the very place where he'd grown up. But George Downing didn't care about his reputation. He cared about power and money. And he had both. In 1663, Charles II created a baronetcy for him, Sir George Downing, 1st Baronet. He married Frances Howard in 1654, a strategic match that advanced his social standing. He accumulated wealth through his government positions, through property, through careful investment, and he had that tract of land south of St. James's Park. In 1682, nearly 60 years old and looking toward retirement, George Downing received permission to develop his land. The warrant specified that he could build houses, but not closer than 14 feet from the park wall. Downing hired architect Christopher Wren, who was simultaneously designing St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the greatest architectural achievements in British history. Wren drew up plans for a row of elegant terraced townhouses, Georgian architecture, symmetrical facades, proper proportions, houses suitable for wealthy courtiers and government officials who needed to be near Parliament and Whitehall. But George Downing, even at the end of his life, remained who he'd always been: cheap, opportunistic, corner-cutting. He wanted maximum profit for minimum investment. So while Wren's designs were sound, Downing's execution was not. He built the houses quickly, using inferior materials. The bricks were cheap yellow stock bricks, not the finest available. The mortar was mixed poorly. The timber was adequate but not exceptional. And crucially, critically, fatally for the long-term stability of these buildings, George Downing refused to invest in proper foundations. The land was marshy, everyone knew it. The area had been the edge of the Thames flood plain for centuries. Whitehall Palace, which once stood nearby, had dealt with drainage problems constantly. Building on marsh requires deep foundations, proper drainage, and careful engineering. George Downing provided none of these things. He laid shallow foundations of rubble and timber, barely sufficient to support two-story brick buildings. The houses were meant to look good from the street, to sell quickly to wealthy buyers, and to generate profit for George Downing. They weren't meant to last centuries. They probably weren't even meant to last decades without serious maintenance. Between 1682 and 1684, Downing raised his row of houses. Most historians estimate 15 to 20 houses total, though the exact number is unclear and the numbering system changed repeatedly over the following decades. What would eventually become number 10 Downing Street started life as number 5. The houses sold, generating profit for Downing, who was now quite elderly and content to retire on his wealth. George Downing never lived on Downing Street. He retired to Cambridge, where he owned property. In 1684, a few months after the construction of his houses was complete, George Downing died. He was around 61 years old. His wealth was substantial. In his will, he stipulated that if his descendants failed in the male line, his accumulated fortune should be used to found a college at Cambridge. That eventually happened. Downing College, Cambridge, was founded in 1800, more than a century after his death, and still exists today. A door from number 10 Downing Street is currently in use at the college, a strange circular connection between the traitor who built the street and the academic institution that bears his name. George Downing left behind a fortune, a baronetcy, a college, and a row of poorly built houses on marsh ground. Those houses started cracking and settling within years. The timber foundations began to rot, the walls developed fissures, the floors became uneven, and one of those houses, through a series of historical accidents and political decisions, became the most famous address in Britain, the most powerful residence in the country, the home of prime ministers, all built on a foundation of betrayal, cheap materials, and rotting wood by a man whose name became synonymous with treachery. For the next 130 years, most prime ministers couldn't stand the place. It was cold, it was drafty, it leaked, the floors were uneven, the walls developed cracks, rooms smelled of damp. In winter, wind howled through gaps in the windows. In summer, the marshy foundation bred mosquitoes. The neighbourhood around Downing Street grew seedy. By the early 1800s, brothels and gin joints filled the nearby streets. Government clerks, working late, would signal with mirrors to dressmakers across the way. The Rose and Crown pub at the end of Downing Street did steady business with overworked civil servants. Prime ministers who had their own comfortable townhouses saw no reason to endure number 10. After Walpole moved out, the house sat empty for 21 years. In 1763, it became the official residence again, but most prime ministers used it as an office while living elsewhere. When Benjamin Disraeli arrived in 1868, he found that no one had actually lived in number 10 for 30 years. He described it as dingy and decaying. The building was literally falling apart. In 1879, a fire destroyed the upper floors of number 12 next door. It was rebuilt as only a single-story structure, a testament to how little anyone cared about maintaining these crumbling houses. The original yellow bricks that George Downing had used were slowly turning black from 2 centuries of London coal smoke and pollution. Nobody bothered to clean them. The grimy, soot-covered façade became the house's defining characteristic. Black bricks on a black door, the colour of power, the colour of secrets. Victorian-era renovations happened in fits and starts. Disraeli persuaded the government to pay for entrance halls and public rooms, though he paid for his private quarters himself. In 1877, hot and cold running water was finally installed. A proper bath cost £150. In 1884, during William Gladstone's tenure, electric lighting and the first telephones arrived. These were cutting-edge technologies, and number 10 was modern enough to adopt them. But modernising the interior didn't fix the foundation. The walls kept cracking. The floors kept sinking. The house should have been demolished a dozen times. Plans were drawn up. Estimates were made. But number 10 had become something more than a building. It was a symbol. By the early 20th century, with the British Empire at its peak, the Prime Minister's residence had taken on mythic significance. To tear it down felt like admitting weakness. So they patched it, they repaired it, they threw money at problems that couldn't really be fixed without starting over. In 1902, Arthur Balfour became the first Prime Minister to actually revive the tradition of living at number 10 full-time. He was already First Lord of the Treasury and already living there when he became PM, so it was convenient. From that point forward, every British Prime Minister has called Downing Street home, at least officially. But even as Number 10 became institutionalized, embedded in British political culture, the building itself was a disaster. Ministry of Works files record endless repairs, money poured in, fixes failed. The house, built on treachery and cheap materials, refused to cooperate. September 3rd, 1939. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain broadcast to the nation from the Cabinet Room. Britain was at war with Germany. The words echoed through Number 10, through a building utterly unprepared for what was coming. When Winston Churchill replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May 1940, he moved into the second-floor flat with his wife Clementine. Churchill did much of his work from bed, propped up with pillows, cigar in hand, dictating speeches and memos to his secretaries. He was 65 years old, overweight and thriving on stress. Number 10 became command central for the British war effort. By October 1940, the Blitz began. German bombers targeted London every night. The wail of air raid sirens became routine. Churchill needed to be close to the action, but Number 10 wasn't safe at all. The building had no bomb shelter. Its walls were brick and plaster. Its roof was slate. A direct hit would obliterate it. On October 14, 1940, at around the 10:08 p.m., a massive bomb fell on Treasury Green, just yards from Downing Street. The explosion was colossal. The kitchen and staterooms at Number 10 were severely damaged. 3 civil servants doing home guard duty nearby were killed instantly. Windows shattered. Plaster fell from ceilings. The building shook on its rotten foundations. Churchill had been dining in the garden rooms in the basement, which had been reinforced with steel beams. The reinforcements saved his life, but only barely. If the bomb had been 30 yards closer, or if Churchill had been upstairs, Britain would have lost its Prime Minister. That night made clear what everyone already knew. Number 10 couldn't protect anyone. Steel reinforcements were added to the garden rooms. Heavy metal shutters went over the windows, but these were band-aids on a structure never designed to withstand war. The Cabinet Room, where crucial war decisions were made, wouldn't have survived a direct hit. The reinforcements might as well have been paper. In October 1939, before the Blitz even started, the War Cabinet had already moved to the Cabinet War Rooms, a bunker complex in the basement of the Office of Works, directly opposite the Foreign Office. These underground rooms, later known as the Churchill War Rooms, were 11 feet below ground level. They weren't fully bomb-proof, but they were safer than anything Downing Street offered. From October 15, 1940 onward, the war rooms were occupied 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, until August 14, 1945, the official end of World War II. Churchill and his wife moved out of the Number 10 flat after the October 14th bombing and relocated to the Number 10 Annex, a flat above the war rooms. Furniture and valuables were removed from Number 10 for safekeeping. Only the garden rooms, cabinet room and private secretary's office remained in use. The house became a ghost of itself, a symbol being used sparingly while the real work happened underground. Churchill also used Down Street, a disused tube station on the Piccadilly line, as an emergency shelter. On the night of the October 14th bombing, Churchill sent his 2 duty private secretaries John Colville and John Peck to Down Street, telling them, "You are too young to die." The younger staff sheltered in a railway bunker, while Churchill himself spent the night monitoring the situation from various locations, including the Air Ministry roof, waiting for attacks that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The Blitz continued. Bombs fell close to Downing Street multiple times. In February 1944, another bomb landed on nearby Horse Guards Parade, shattering drawing room windows at Number 10. The building accumulated scars. Chunks of plaster fell, walls cracked further, but it survived. Churchill continued working and dining there throughout the war, though he slept elsewhere. He loved the symbolism. The Prime Minister at his desk in Number 10, defiant, while German bombers circled overhead. When the war ended in 1945, Churchill made his victory in Europe broadcast from the Cabinet Room at 3 p.m. on May 8th. The house was battered but intact. No direct hits, no total destruction, just damage, always more damage, layered on top of the structural problems that had existed since 1682. But the war revealed something crucial. Number 10 was iconic, irreplaceable symbolically, but physically it was a liability. The post-war years would force Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth. The building had to be saved, and saving it would require tearing it apart. By the early 1950s, Number 10 was in crisis. Bomb damage had worsened existing structural problems, but this wasn't just about the war. The house was suffering from subsidence, sloping walls, and twisting door frames. The façade was leaning outward as much as 7.5 inches from vertical at the top. Inside, dry rot consumed timber. Wood-boring beetles ate through beams. Floors were uneven, some sagging noticeably. Plumbing was ancient and poorly laid out. Brickwork was cracked throughout. The Ministry of Works carried out a survey in 1954. The report was damning. The building was dying. The survey bounced from Winston Churchill, 1951-1955, to Anthony Eden, 1955-1957, to Harold Macmillan, 1957-1963, as prime ministers came and went, each one reluctant to deal with the scale of the problem. Finally, Macmillan set up a committee to investigate. The committee's conclusion: drastic action was required before the building fell down or burned to the ground. Several options were considered. One was to continue with extraordinary first aid repairs as needed, accepting the risk of major collapse. Another was to acknowledge that the houses had reached the end of their useful life and rebuild them almost entirely. The most radical option: complete demolition of numbers 10, 11, and 12, replacing them with a modern building designed for the needs of a 20th century government. But demolition was unthinkable. By 1958, Number 10 had become an icon of British architecture, as recognisable as Windsor Castle, Buckingham Palace, or the Houses of Parliament. The Ministry of Works wrote, "The houses in Downing Street are deeply embedded in our history. To tear them down would be to admit defeat, to surrender to the shoddy workmanship of George Downing and the centuries of neglect that followed. So they chose reconstruction, not demolition, but a complete gutting and rebuilding, preserving historic features while essentially building a new house inside the old shell. The project would be massive, expensive, and disruptive. The Prime Minister and Chancellor would have to move out for several years while the work was done. Winston Churchill and his Chancellor, Rab Butler, both accepted the need to proceed in 1955, but they delayed the start until the middle of 1958. Neither wanted to deal with the disruption of moving out. Finally, in 1960, under Harold Macmillan, the work began. Architect Raymond Erith was put in charge. The scale of the project stunned everyone involved. When workers started tearing into the walls and floors, they found horrors. The huge timber beams supporting the foundations had decayed almost completely. They were rotten, crumbling, barely holding the weight of the building. New foundations of reinforced concrete had to be poured, with piles driven 6 to 18 feet deep into the marshy ground. More than half of the existing fabric of the building had to be renewed. Main brick walls were either grouted or reconstructed entirely. Roofs and most floors were replaced. Modern electrical, plumbing, and heating systems were installed. And then came the discovery that changed everything. When workers cleaned the exterior bricks, they found that they weren't black at all. The original bricks were yellow. 2 centuries of London coal smoke, pollution, and grime had stained them black. The famous black bricks of 10 Downing Street were an accident of environmental damage, but when the cleaned yellow bricks were revealed, they looked wrong, shockingly wrong. For more than a century, Number 10 had been black. That was its identity. That's what people expected. A yellow Number 10 would be unrecognizable. So a decision was made. The bricks would be painted black. The lie would be preserved. The building's public image mattered more than historical accuracy. The reconstruction took 3 years and cost £1 million, 1 year late and £500,000 over budget. Approximately 40% of number 10 was restored using original or replica materials. The other 60% was entirely new construction. Carved columns in the cabinet room that were beyond repair were replicated in exact detail. Historic rooms were photographed, measured, disassembled, and reassembled on the new foundation. Architect John Soane's 1825 state dining room, with its shallow vaulted ceiling and elegant panelling, required extraordinary care. The whole ceiling was taken down in pieces, stored off-site, while new roof structures were built, then reassembled and tied back to the new supports so seamlessly that the surgery is invisible today. Raymond Erith was meticulous. He revered historic architecture and particularly admired Soane's work. The rebuilt number 10 became more Soanean than it had been before, with Erith extending Soane's design principles to rooms that had been Victorian or later. It was a love letter to 18th century elegance wrapped around 20th century infrastructure. The work wasn't without drama. By November 1961, the project was 3 months behind schedule. Unexpected structural problems kept emerging. Strikes by plumbers in 1962 shut down the site for months. Costs spiraled. Erith wrote panicked letters to the Ministry of Works about the state of affairs at Downing Street. But the work continued. Number 12, badly damaged by fire in 1879 and reduced to a single story, was rebuilt to its full height. But unlike numbers 10 and 11, which had their new bricks painted black to match the old sooty appearance, number 12 was given red brick, marking it as new construction. The 3 houses now present an odd visual: 2 black facades and 1 red, all technically part of the same complex. When the work was finally completed in 1963, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan moved back into a house that looked the same but was fundamentally different. The walls stood straight, the floors were level, the plumbing worked, the heating was modern, but the house still wasn't safe. It never would be, because in 1963 nobody was thinking about mortars. February 7th, 1991, 10:08 a.m. Prime Minister John Major's War Cabinet was meeting in the Cabinet Room. Present were senior politicians, civil servants and military leaders discussing Britain's role in the Gulf War. Outside, a white Ford Transit van turned onto Whitehall at the junction with Horse Guards Avenue, roughly 200 yards from Downing Street. The driver parked, got off and left on a waiting motorcycle. Several minutes later, a policeman started walking toward the van to investigate. Then the roof blew off. 3 homemade mortar shells launched from a Mark 10 mortar hidden inside the van. Each shell was 4.5 feet long, weighed 140 pounds, and carried 40 pounds of Semtex plastic explosive. An incendiary device detonated inside the van, destroying forensic evidence and setting the vehicle on fire. 2 of the shells overshot their target and landed on Mountbatten Green near the Foreign Office. 1 exploded, 1 didn't. The 3rd shell arced through the morning sky and exploded in the back garden of number 10, 30 yards from the Cabinet Room, where the Prime Minister and his War Cabinet were meeting. The explosion was massive. The building shook. The Cabinet Room's bomb-resistant windows, installed after earlier IRA threats, buckled inward but didn't shatter. Glass and debris flew. Politicians and civil servants dove under the cabinet table. The sound was deafening. Then came the aftershock, another concussive wave rolling through the building. For several seconds, nobody moved. Prime Minister John Major, lying under the table, broke the silence. "I think we had better start again somewhere else." The room was evacuated. The meeting reconvened less than 10 minutes later in the Cabinet Office briefing rooms known as COBR, deep underground. No cabinet members were hurt, but 4 people sustained minor injuries, including 2 police officers hit by flying debris outside. The Provisional Irish Republican Army claimed responsibility immediately, issuing a statement from Dublin. Let the British government understand that while nationalist people in the 6 counties are forced to live under British rule, then the British cabinet will be forced to meet in bunkers. The attack was sophisticated and daring. The IRA had planned it for months. 2 members of the organisation had travelled to London in mid-1990 to scout the site. One was an expert in mortar trajectories. The other, from the Belfast Brigade, knew how to build them. They purchased a Ford Transit van, rented a garage and built the Mark X mortar system inside, cutting through the roof and installing a launch platform. They studied the approach to Downing Street, calculated angles and distances, and waited for a publicly announced cabinet meeting. The original target had been Margaret Thatcher, who topped the IRA's assassination list after they nearly killed her in the 1984 Brighton Hotel bombing. But Thatcher resigned unexpectedly in November 1990. The IRA Army Council decided to proceed anyway, targeting her successor, John Major. They waited until the date of a cabinet meeting was publicly known, then executed the plan with military precision. Security around Downing Street had already been stepped up after increased IRA activity in 1988. Iron gates had been installed at the entrance to the street in 1989, turning the cul-de-sac into a fortress. A police guard post monitored access, but the gates didn't stop mortars. The attack proved that even with enhanced security, Downing Street was vulnerable to indirect fire from nearby streets. The van was parked in Jean d'Alston, plain sight on Whitehall, one of London's busiest thoroughfares, lined with government buildings. In a matter of minutes, the attackers had driven in, launched 3 mortars, and escaped on a motorcycle. Police sealed off the entire government district afterward, from the Houses of Parliament to Trafalgar Square, but the damage was done. The aftermath was transformative. The original black oak door, battered by the explosion, was replaced with a blast-proof steel door weighing so much it takes 8 men to lift it. The door is now regularly removed every 2 years for refurbishment and replaced with an identical backup. It cannot be opened from the outside. There's no working door handle, no keyhole. A guard inside, monitoring a video screen, opens it remotely when authorized visitors approach. The famous brass letterbox still bears the engraving First Lord of the Treasury, but after 1991 it's purely decorative. No letters can actually be posted through it. Windows throughout number 10 were upgraded to bomb-resistant glass. Security protocols tightened dramatically. The gates at the entrance to Downing Street, which some had criticised as excessive, were vindicated. Without them, a car bomb driven directly to number 10's door would have been catastrophic. The IRA had proven they could strike at the heart of British government in broad daylight. The only response was to turn Downing Street into a harder target. A splinter from the 1991 mortar explosion remains embedded in the plasterwork upstairs. It was left there intentionally, a scar, a reminder. Power has a price. Symbols attract violence. And number 10, for all its history and grandeur, is a building that people want to destroy. The problem with number 10 is that it never stops breaking. The 1960s reconstruction bought time, maybe 40 or 50 years before another crisis. But by 2006, the building was failing again. Independent surveys established that number 10 was no longer weathertight. Water leaked through the roof. The heating system was failing. Power outages were frequent. The information and communications technology network was at its limits. The building couldn't support the modern Prime Minister's office. Occupancy had increased dramatically over the years, from a stable workforce of around 50 people for decades to roughly 170 by 2006. More people meant more strain, more computers meant more heat and more electrical demand. The aging infrastructure couldn't cope. Prime Minister Tony Blair authorised a new programme of improvements in 2006, with the building remaining operational throughout. Structural issues were tackled first. A phased exterior repair project addressed failing lead guttering, cracking brickwork, and other problems. The distinctive black paint, which had faded in many areas to reveal the yellow bricks underneath, was renewed. Workers discovered that the facade of number 11 Downing Street was unstable. The wall was actually pulling away from the building. To stabilize it, 225 stainless steel pins were drilled through the brick, anchoring the facade to the interior structure. Without those pins, number 11's front wall could have collapsed. The work continued year after year. Heating systems were upgraded, fire protection was improved, electrical power distribution was replaced. Computer cables were installed in 1995 to handle growing IT demands. In 1997, the building was remodeled to provide extra space for Prime Minister Tony Blair's greatly expanded staff. Sustainability initiatives began in 2009, including rainwater harvesting to provide water for the garden and reductions in carbon emissions. The house requires constant maintenance. Rooms are redecorated regularly, furnishings are updated. Prime Ministers have always left their mark on number 10. Margaret Thatcher commissioned architect Quinlan Terry in the 1980s to refurbish the state drawing rooms, adding ornate plasterwork ceilings with national emblems of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Tony Blair oversaw major refurbishments in the late 1990s. David Cameron brought in designer updates. Each occupant tries to make the house feel like home while knowing they're temporary residents in a building that belongs to history. Living at number 10 has its complications. The official residence for the Prime Minister is the flat on the 3rd floor, but it's relatively small. Number 11 next door, traditionally the Chancellor of the Exchequer's residence, has a larger flat. In recent decades, Prime Ministers with large families have swapped residences. Tony Blair and his family lived at number 11 because they had young children and needed more space. Chancellor Gordon Brown, unmarried at the time, stayed in the smaller number 10 flat. David Cameron and his family also lived at number 11, with Chancellor George Osborne taking the smaller space at number 10. The tradition has become flexible. Some Prime Ministers, like Rishi Sunak, have preferred to stay in the smaller number 10 flat. Meanwhile, the state rooms continue their endless cycle of use and decay. The Cabinet Room, with its famous long table and chairs dating from the Gladstone era, sees weekly meetings. The Prime Minister sits in the only chair with arms, positioned in front of the marble fireplace, facing the windows. On the wall hangs a portrait of Robert Walpole, the first Prime Minister, watching over his successors. The pillared drawing room, terracotta room, and white drawing room are used for receptions and meetings with foreign dignitaries. John Logie Baird demonstrated his invention, the television, in one of these rooms to Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Harold Wilson hosted the Apollo 11 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins there after the moon landing. Tony Blair entertained the England Rugby Union team after their World Cup victory in 2003. The rooms have witnessed history, but the walls keep cracking. That's the paradox of number 10. It's simultaneously priceless and worthless. Culturally, it's one of the most important buildings in the world, a symbol of democratic governance and British continuity. Practically, it's a money pit, a structural nightmare held together by modern engineering and political will. The house has been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing original remains. The bricks are painted, the foundation is concrete, the interior is 20th century construction. Even the door is modern steel, but it looks like it always did. The black facade, the white trim, the famous number 10 with the zero tilted at 37 degrees, either because that's how the original was painted or because it's actually a capital O from the Roman Trajan alphabet favoured by the Ministry of Works, depending on which theory you believe. From the outside, number 10 looks modest, almost humble. A terraced house in a short cul-de-sac, but inside it's a maze of over 100 rooms spread across multiple floors and connecting buildings. Corridors twist in unexpected directions. Staircases appear where they shouldn't. The layout makes no sense because the building is actually multiple buildings merged together over centuries. Walpole's house, the mansion at the back, the houses absorbed from next door. All of it stitched together into a functioning whole that confuses visitors and requires long-time staff to navigate. This is the machine that runs Britain, not Buckingham Palace, which is ceremonial, not Parliament, which is legislative. Number 10 is executive power. This is where decisions are made, where strategies are formed, where wars are planned and peace is negotiated, and it's held together by steel pins and fresh paint. There's a photograph that tells you everything you need to know about what Number 10 does to the people who live there. Margaret Thatcher in 1979, addressing a press conference in Dublin, looks confident, energetic, fierce. Margaret Thatcher in 1990, making her final speech outside Downing Street before heading to resign, looks older, harder, worn down. It's only 11 years, but they're 11 years at Number 10. The pattern repeats with every Prime Minister. Tony Blair arrived in 1997 at 43, charismatic and fresh-faced, talking about a new dawn. By 2007, a decade in office and mired in the Iraq War, Blair looked 20 years older. Eye bags, pallid skin, permanently furrowed brow. The stress had physically reshaped him. Gordon Brown lasted 3 years as Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. The job aged him rapidly. Photographs show the toll, the weight of responsibility visible in every line on his face. David Cameron, who became Prime Minister at 43, one of the youngest in modern history, left office 6 years later, looking decades older. The office devours youth. Winston Churchill, serving twice as Prime Minister, 1940, 1945, and 1951, 1955, famously slept only 4 hours a night during the war. He consumed cigars and brandy in quantities that would kill most people. He worked from bed, from the bath, from anywhere he happened to be. The job almost killed him multiple times, but Churchill seemed to thrive on the stress in ways most people can't. He's the exception that proves the rule. The pressure of Number 10 isn't just political, it's physical, mental, emotional. Prime Ministers work 18-hour days. They're constantly on call. World events don't respect office hours. A crisis in the Middle East happens in the middle of the night. An economic collapse requires immediate response. Every decision carries weight. Every mistake is public. The media scrutinizes everything. Opposition politicians attack constantly. Your own party plots against you, and through it all, you're living in a building that's actively trying to kill you. Margaret Thatcher called Number 10 one of the most precious jewels in the national heritage in 1985, but she also ran a kitchen cabinet, inviting senior ministers upstairs to the flat for informal meetings over tea while cooking fish pie for her husband, Dennis. The informality was strategic. It let her work around formal cabinet structures, but it also reveals something about the isolation of the office. The Prime Minister can't just go out, can't just have a normal meal in a restaurant. Security won't allow it, so you bring people to your kitchen. You govern from your living room. Your home becomes, your office becomes your prison. Tony and Cherie Blair had 3 children living at home when they moved into Number 10, so they took the larger flat at Number 11. In 2000, Cherie gave birth to Leo Blair, making him the first baby born to a serving Prime Minister in over 150 years. The Blairs tried to maintain some sense of family normalcy, but how do you raise children in a building where armed guards patrol the halls and every window has blast-resistant glass? David and Samantha Cameron brought 3 young children to Downing Street. They renovated the Number 11 kitchen, bringing in bright yellow sofas and Jamie Oliver cookware, trying to make it feel like a home. It didn't really work. Their son Ivan, who had cerebral palsy and epilepsy, required constant medical care. He died in 2009, aged 6, while the Camerons lived at Number 10. No amount of renovation can make that bearable. Some prime ministers never really lived there at all. Liz Truss, who lasted only 49 days as prime minister, called number 10 a soulless cage with fleas, blaming the fleas on Boris Johnson's badly behaved Jack Russell. She never unpacked her removal boxes. Other prime ministers found ways to love the building. Harold Wilson spoke about the sense of history and tradition, how you can't apply yourself to present problems without understanding the people who came before. That weight of history can be inspiring or crushing, depending on the person. The building remembers everyone who lived there. Portraits line the staircases. Robert Walpole, William Pitt the Younger, Benjamin Disraeli, William Gladstone, David Lloyd, George, Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher. Their faces watch current occupants, a reminder that you're temporary, that the building will outlast you, that your time here is just another chapter in a story that began with a traitor and might never end. From the street, number 10 Downing Street appears modest, almost humble. A simple black door, white-trimmed windows, a terraced house that wouldn't look out of place on any Georgian street in London. But this facade is one of the great deceptions in British architecture. Step through that black door and you enter a warren of over 100 rooms spread across multiple floors, connecting buildings and hidden passageways. The building is actually multiple structures merged together over centuries, creating a layout so confusing that new staff members get lost regularly and long-time employees still discover rooms they didn't know existed. The confusion starts immediately upon entry. The famous black door opens into a surprisingly modest entrance hall, black and white marble tiles on the floor, a pattern that's been there since the 18th century. A guard's chair in one corner, designed by Thomas Chippendale, sits empty now, but still carries scratches on the right arm where police officers' pistols rubbed against the leather over decades. To the right, the main corridor stretches back into the building, past offices and meeting rooms. To the left, a staircase climbs toward the staterooms on the first floor. The walls are lined with portraits of former prime ministers, arranged chronologically, creating a visual timeline of British political history. Climb that staircase and you enter a different world. The state rooms on the first floor are grand, designed to impress and intimidate. The pillared drawing room measures 37 feet long by 28 feet wide, taking its name from twin Ionic pilasters with straight pediments at one end. The room has hosted kings and presidents, astronauts and rugby champions. A portrait of Queen Elizabeth I hangs over the fireplace. During the Thatcher, Major and Blair years, a portrait of William Pitt hung there instead. Prime ministers change the art to reflect their preferences, their politics, their sense of history. The room is used for receptions, for important meetings, for photo opportunities, when the Prime Minister wants to project gravitas and tradition. Next door is the terracotta room, named for whatever colour it happens to be painted at the moment. When Margaret Thatcher came to power, it was the Blue Room. She had it redecorated and renamed the Green Room. Later occupants changed it again. The name changes with the wallpaper, but the function remains constant. It's a drawing room, a space for smaller gatherings, for private conversations before larger events, for moments when you need elegance without the overwhelming scale of the pillared room. The white drawing room, until the 1940s, was for the private use of prime ministers and their spouses. Edward Heath kept his grand piano there in the 1970s. It's now used constantly as a backdrop for television interviews and as a meeting room for Downing Street staff. The room links through to the terracotta room, creating a suite of interconnected spaces that allow receptions to flow naturally from room to room. In the 1980s, architect Quinlan Terry added ornate plasterwork ceilings to these rooms, including national emblems of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales in the white drawing room. Carved into the plasterwork above the door leading to the pillared room is a tribute to Margaret Thatcher herself. A straw-carrying figure, a Thatcher. It's a pun, a private joke, a way of immortalizing her in the building she transformed. Down another corridor is the state dining room, arguably the most architecturally significant room in the entire building. Designed by Sir John Soane in 1825–1826, it's a masterpiece of elegant restraint. Soane created the room above the vaulted kitchen added by Sir Robert Taylor in the 1780s, which meant major structural work. He punched up into the roof space, rerouting kitchen flues that ran through the middle of where he wanted to build. The result is a double-height room with a shallow vaulted ceiling, oak panelling from floor to ceiling, and proportions that feel both intimate and grand. The table can seat up to 20 people comfortably. Prime ministers host state dinners here, honouring foreign leaders, celebrating political victories, conducting the social side of diplomacy. The oak panelling was removed during the 1960s reconstruction, stripped, stored, and then returned to the rebuilt room. It's one of the few elements of number 10 that has survived relatively unchanged since the 19th century. The cabinet room is where the real work happens. It's on the ground floor, overlooking the garden, positioned so the Prime Minister can see the lawn where a mortar shell exploded in 1991. The room contains a long coffin-shaped table surrounded by carved mahogany chairs that date from the Gladstone era. The only chair with arms belongs to the Prime Minister, positioned midway along one side in front of the marble fireplace, facing the windows. When not in use, it's angled for easy access. The chair is positioned so the Prime Minister can see everyone at the table, can make eye contact, can dominate the room both physically and symbolically. On the wall hangs a copy of a portrait of Robert Walpole by Jean-Baptiste Van Loo, the first Prime Minister watching over all who follow. The Cabinet meets here weekly, usually on Tuesdays or Thursdays. The meetings are formal, structured, recorded, minutes are taken, decisions are documented. This is where wars are declared, budgets are approved, laws are drafted. This is the operational heart of British government. Behind the cabinet room, deeper into the building, are the garden rooms. These were reinforced with steel during World War II, creating a relatively safe space where Churchill could work and dine even during bombing raids. The reinforcements are still there, hidden behind walls and ceilings. The rooms include a small dining area, bedrooms and offices. Civil servants work here around the clock, drafting speeches, preparing briefings, responding to crises that don't respect business hours. The term garden rooms is slightly misleading. Yes, they overlook the garden, but they're not decorative spaces. They're working areas, utilitarian, focused on function over form. Above the state rooms on the second and third floors are the private apartments. The official Prime Minister's flat occupies the third floor of the original house. It's relatively small, about 4 rooms, suitable for a couple or a small family. It includes a bedroom, sitting room, kitchen and bathroom. The ceilings are lower here, the rooms more domestic in scale. This is where Prime Ministers are supposed to retreat from the pressures of office, to sleep and eat and spend time with family. But the flat is small, and modern Prime Ministers often have larger families than the apartment can comfortably accommodate. Hence, the practice of swapping with the Chancellor, who officially resides at number 11 next door, which has a significantly larger flat spread across multiple floors. The swap became common under Tony Blair, who had 3 children living at home and needed space. Gordon Brown, his Chancellor, was unmarried when he took office and content with the smaller flat at number 10. When Blair became Prime Minister, he and Brown simply traded apartments. David Cameron continued this practice, living at number 11 with his family, while Chancellor George Osborne took the smaller flat at number 10. The flexibility makes sense practically, even if it confuses the symbolic arrangement. The official residence is number 10, but the Prime Minister might actually sleep next door. Between and beneath these visible formal spaces runs a hidden network. Service corridors connect the buildings, allowing staff to move unseen. The corridors are narrow, painted institutional colours, lit by fluorescent tubes. They're purely functional, designed so servants could once tend fires and deliver meals without disturbing the principal occupants. Today they're used by security personnel, maintenance staff, and civil servants who need to move between buildings without appearing in the public-facing corridors. Staircases appear in unexpected places, connecting floors in ways that make no logical sense until you understand that they're linking multiple buildings that were never designed to be connected. The basement extends further than most people realize. It contains the famous kitchen, still vaulted, dating from the 1780s, now modernized with industrial equipment. Storage rooms hold everything from archived documents to spare furniture to equipment for state functions. Secure communications rooms, added during the Cold War and upgraded constantly since, allow the Prime Minister to speak with military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and foreign leaders over encrypted lines. A bowling alley, installed decades ago, still exists, though it's rarely used. An indoor swimming pool, added later, gets more use from Prime Minister families trying to maintain some normalcy. And deeper still, connecting to the Churchill war rooms across the street, are passages and bunkers that allow the government to continue operating if the above-ground building becomes uninhabitable. This is the machine, not the symbol of the black door, not the elegance of the staterooms, but this warren of offices and corridors, these basements full of equipment, these service passages and hidden staircases. This is what actually runs Britain. Roughly 200 people work in this building daily, far more than it was ever designed to hold. They occupy every available room, converting historic bedrooms into offices, turning drawing rooms into meeting spaces, cramming desks into corridors. The building groans under the weight of modern government. Every few years, another crisis emerges. The IT network can't handle the demand. The heating system fails. Water leaks through the roof. And another round of repairs begins. Another £1 million spent keeping the structure barely functional. Number 10. Downing Street isn't really a house. It hasn't been a house for centuries. It's an organism, constantly adapting, constantly failing, constantly being patched back together. It's held together by tradition, by symbolism, by the shared belief that this specific building matters more than its structural inadequacies. The black door opens, another Prime Minister walks through, the maze swallows them, and somewhere deep in the walls another crack appears. So who really paid for number 10? Who pays for it now? The answer isn't simple. King George II gave the house to Robert Walpole in 1735, but the conversion costs came from government funds. For 290 years, every renovation, every repair, every modernisation has been paid for by British taxpayers. The 1960s reconstruction cost £1 million. The 2006 repairs cost millions more. The ongoing maintenance is a permanent line item in the government budget. But money isn't the only currency. The builders who raised George Downing's shoddy houses in the 1680s paid with their labour and their health, working for wages in a time when worker safety didn't exist. The servants who staffed number 10 for centuries paid with their lives, spending decades in service to occupants who barely noticed them. The civil servants killed by the bomb in October 1940 paid with their lives. The politicians who age decades in a few years pay with their health and sanity. The building itself paid. It's been rebuilt so many times that the ship of Theseus question applies. If you replace every part of a building, is it still the same building? Number 10 today is 60% new construction. The bricks are painted to look old. The foundation is modern concrete. The walls are steel reinforced. Even the door is a replica. The only thing truly original is the location and the idea. The idea that this modest terraced house represents British power, that democracy lives here, that the decisions made behind that black door shape the world. That idea has survived bombs, fires, structural collapse, terrorist attacks, political scandals, and centuries of neglect. It survived because people refused to let it die. because tearing down number 10 would feel like tearing down something essential about Britain itself. So they keep rebuilding, keep repairing, keep painting the bricks black to hide the yellow underneath, keep opening that steel door for another Prime Minister to walk through. The dark story of 10 Downing Street is that it shouldn't exist. It was built by a traitor on swampy ground with cheap materials and shallow foundations. It should have collapsed in the 18th century. It should have been demolished in the 19th. It should have burned down in the 20th. The Luftwaffe tried to destroy it. The IRA tried to destroy it. Time itself has been trying to destroy it for 340 years. And yet it stands, cracked, patched, painted, reinforced with steel pins, but standing. That's the real power of number 10, not the people who live there, who are temporary and replaceable, not the decisions made there, which can be wise or catastrophic. The power is in the survival, in the refusal to give up, in the stubborn insistence that this building, this idea, matters enough to save. The black door opens, another Prime Minister walks through. The walls settle infinitesimally on their foundation. The steel pins hold the façade in place. The painted bricks hide the yellow underneath. And somewhere in the basement, a splinter from a 1991 mortar shell remains embedded in the plaster, a reminder that survival always comes at a cost. If you made it this far, you understand that the most famous addresses in the world hide the darkest secrets. 10. Downing Street isn't just a residence. It's a 3-century battle against physics, economics, terrorism, and time itself. It's a testament to human stubbornness and political necessity. This is what we do here. We dig into the hidden histories of the world's most powerful places and pull out the stories they don't want you to know. The dark foundations, the secret repairs, the human costs behind the symbols. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button if this investigation was worth your time. Drop a comment telling me which historic building we should investigate next. The Kremlin, the White House, Buckingham Palace, Versailles. Every famous residence has secrets, every palace has shadows, and we're going to find them all. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that behind every icon is a foundation that's probably crumbling. See you in the next investigation.